The sentence was not shouted. That was what made it dangerous. It slipped out softly, almost casually, carried on the hum of the studio lights and the faint metallic echo of camera tracks sliding across the floor. It wasn't meant for him. It wasn't meant to wound. It was the kind of sentence people say when they think no one important is listening. And yet, the moment it reached Dean Martin's ears, time hesitated. Las Vegas, 1960. Outside Caesar's palace, the desert sun burned without mercy, flattening shadows and turning the air into something heavy and bright. Inside, the temperature dropped instantly. Artificial air cooled the cavernous casino set where Ocean's 11 was being filmed. The contrast felt symbolic, heat and glare outside, polish and illusion within. The set was immaculate. Casino tables gleamed beneath studio lights. Extras in tailored suits and cocktail dresses stood frozen between takes, cigarette holders angled just right, smiles practiced and effortless. The clink of fake chips echoed faintly. Everything looked real because everything had been carefully designed to look unreal. This was a production built on confidence. Big names, big money, big expectations. And there at the edge of it all sat Dean Martin. He was angled slightly away from the camera, jacket slipped off one shoulder, tie loosened just enough to look careless without being sloppy. A paper cup of coffee rested in his hand, long since gone cold. He hadn't taken a sip in minutes. In his other hand, a lighter, chrome, familiar, balanced perfectly between his fingers. From the outside, he looked exactly as the world expected him to look. Relaxed, untouchable, effortless. A man who seemed to drift through life, the way smoke drifted through a room. But Dean Martin was not drifting. He was waiting. No one knew what for, not even him. The lighter clicked once. Nothing happened. He hadn't pressed hard enough. He adjusted his thumb, eyes half-lidded, and brought it closer to the cigarette. That was when he heard it. Behind the camera tracks, half hidden by light stands and cables, a small group of crew members stood in conversation. Their voices were low, threaded with ambition and impatience. One of them, a young assistant director, no more than 24, leaned forward slightly as he spoke. "Sinatra reads the script 3 times, the young man said, a note of admiration in his voice. "Sammy rehearses everything, every step, every pause." Someone murmured agreement. Then the young man laughed softly. "But Dean," he continued, "he just shows up, smiles, and the camera rolls, makes you wonder." There was a pause, a small one. Then the sentence. Does this guy actually act, or is he just being himself? The lighter froze in Dean's hand. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough that the flame never appeared. For a fraction of a second, the world went silent. The casino set remained intact. Lights stayed on. People moved. But inside Dean Martin's mind, something ancient stirred. A door he had sealed decades ago creaked open, letting in a draft he had spent his entire life learning how to keep out. Because he had heard that sentence before. Not those exact words, but the same meaning. The same dismissal dressed up as curiosity. The same judgment disguised as observation. 20 years earlier. Another room, another voice. New York City. Back when his name was still Dino Crosty. Dean's jaw tightened, barely perceptible. He didn't look toward the voice. He didn't react. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But Frank Sinatra, standing near the monitor, noticed the shift immediately. Frank had known Dean long enough to recognize the signs. The tapping fingers, the way his shoulders squared without him realizing it. The stillness that wasn't relaxation, but restraint. Sammy Davis, Jr., noticed too. He stopped mid-sentence, eyes flicking toward Dean for half a second longer than necessary. Something had landed. Dean finally pressed the lighter again. The flame ignited. He lit the cigarette, inhaled slowly, and let the smoke settle his breath. The noise of the set rushed back in, louder than before. But the silence stayed. Because Dean Martin wasn't in Las Vegas anymore. He was standing in a narrow hallway in a small radio station in New York, the air stale and thin. The walls close enough to feel like they were leaning in. The audition room door behind him had closed softly, too softly to be kind. Inside that room, a man had sat behind a desk, papers stacked unevenly, eyes already tired of the world. "Enough," the man had said. "Just one word." Dean had stopped singing immediately, heart still racing, hope still hanging in the air where his voice had been moments earlier. The man didn't look up. "Your voice is too ethnic," he'd said flatly. "And that name, Dino Krusty, it won't work here. Americans won't understand it." Dean had swallowed hard. "You shouldn't be here," the man continued. "This isn't for you. No anger, no cruelty. Just certainty." The door closing. Dean in the hallway, hands shaking, eyes burning, refusing to cry because he knew. If he cried, he might believe them. Back on the Ocean's 11 set, Dean exhaled smoke slowly through his nose. The young assistant director was still talking, unaware. Someone shifted uncomfortably beside him, sensing something was wrong but not knowing what. Dean stood up. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but decisively. The movement alone changed the energy of the room. Conversations faltered. A lighting technician turned instinctively. A cameraman lowered his lens. Dean Martin did not rush. He walked calmly, each step measured, his presence expanding with every foot of distance he closed. This was not a star's stroll. This was something else entirely. This was a reckoning. The young assistant director finally looked up. And froze. Dean stopped in front of him, close enough that the young man could smell tobacco and aftershave. Dean's voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. "Can you repeat that?" The set went quiet. The young man swallowed. I might have been misunderstood, Mr. Martin." Dean shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't misunderstand." He held the young man's gaze, not with anger, but with something heavier. "How old are you?" Dean asked. 24, the young man answered, barely audible. Dean nodded. "When I was your age," he said, "I was kicked out of a room. People leaned in without realizing it. They told me my voice didn't belong," Dean continued. "That my name was wrong, that people like me shouldn't expect doors to open." He paused. "And for a moment," he said quietly, "I almost believed them." The young man looked down, shame flooding his face. Dean turned away, not from him but toward the set. "Get ready," he said louder now. "We're rolling." Then he walked back to his chair and sat down. Just like that. No shouting, no threats, no humiliation. But nothing on that set was the same anymore. Frank Sinatra sat beside him a moment later, saying nothing at first, just being there. "You okay?" Frank asked softly. Dean nodded, "Yeah." But his eyes told a different story. Because somewhere deep inside him, a woman's voice echoed, gentle, steady, unshakable. "If you agree with them, then they're right. But if you don't, their opinion doesn't matter." Dean stared ahead as the cameras prepared to roll. The scene was about to begin. But the real story had only just started. The cameras rolled. That alone should have restored order. On a film set, the sound of action usually acts like gravity. People fall back into position. Movements align. Doubt disappears. Performance takes over. But this time, even as the red light blinked on and the director's voice echoed across the casino floor, something refused to settle. Dean Martin stepped into the frame. He adjusted his cuff, tilted his head, let the familiar half-smile form at the corner of his mouth. The smile everyone knew. The smile that had paid for houses, filled theaters, carried him across continents. But tonight it felt heavier. Dean delivered his lines with flawless timing. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. The cadence was perfect, the charm intact. Anyone watching the monitor would have seen the same Dean Martin they'd always seen, loose, amused, effortless. Except it wasn't effortless anymore. Each word pulled something up from deep inside him. Each beat of silence between lines stretched longer than written. Something unspoken threaded itself through the performance, something raw enough that even the extras, trained to fade into the background, felt it. The director leaned closer to the monitor. "Don't cut," he whispered. No one did. Frank Sinatra stood with his arms folded, eyes locked on Dean, sensing it clearly now. This wasn't acting. This was memory bleeding through the character. And memory was dangerous. When the scene ended, there was no immediate applause, no casual chatter. The silence lingered like smoke that hadn't found a way out yet. "Cut," the director finally said, almost reluctantly. Dean stepped out of frame and exhaled slowly. That was when the young assistant director approached again. Carefully this time. "Mr. Martin," he said, voice quieter than before, "I wanted to say I'm sorry." Dean looked at him, really looked. Not as a star looks at a subordinate, but as one human being looks at another standing at the edge of becoming something, better or worse. "Sit," Dean said, nodding toward an empty chair. The young man obeyed instantly. They sat side by side while the crew reset the scene around them. The noise returned in fragments, metal clinking, voices overlapping, but time bent around the two of them. "You think what you said was about me?" Dean began. The young man nodded. "I do." Dean shook his head slowly. "It wasn't," he said. "It was about you." The young man frowned, confused. "When people talk like that," Dean continued, "they're not measuring talent, they're measuring safety. They want to know who fits in the box they already understand." He paused, and when someone doesn't fit, it scares them. The young man swallowed. "I didn't mean." "I know," Dean said, cutting him off gently. "Most damage is done by people who don't mean to do any." The young man stared at the floor, his ambition suddenly exposed, fragile. "They laugh at me because I don't rehearse," Dean said. "They think I don't care. Truth is, caring too much almost destroyed me once." The word surprised even Dean himself. He hadn't planned to say that. The young man looked up. "Destroyed you how?" Dean didn't answer immediately. Because once he did, there would be no taking it back. Across the set, Sammy Davis, Jr., noticed the stillness between them. He nudged Frank lightly. "Something's happening." Frank nodded. "Yeah, and it's been happening a long time." Dean leaned back in his chair. "When I was younger," he said, voice low, "I wanted them to take me seriously. I wanted them to hear me, not just enjoy me." He smiled faintly. "That was my mistake." The young man listened, unmoving. "They'll take what you give them," Dean went on. "But they'll only take as much as makes them comfortable, and if you offer more than that, they'll tell you you're doing it wrong." A pause. "So I learned to survive," Dean said. "I learned to smile before they could doubt me, to look relaxed before they could reject me. It worked." He met the young man's eyes again. "But it cost something." Before the young man could ask what, a voice interrupted them. "Dean." The voice came from behind. Dean turned slowly, and his chest tightened. The man standing there wore a consultant's badge clipped neatly to his jacket. Mid-40s, trim hair, calm expression, a black notebook tucked under his arm. But Dean didn't see the badge. He saw a desk. He saw a room without windows. He saw himself standing 20 years younger, hope trembling in his hands. The man smiled politely. "I don't think we've met properly. I'm assisting the production." Dean stood up. "I think we have," he said. The consultant hesitated, studying Dean's face more closely now. Recognition flickered, faint, uncertain, then unmistakable. A ripple of discomfort crossed the man's features. "You were," the man began, then stopped. Dean finished it for him, "the one who told me I shouldn't be there." Silence spread between them. Crew members nearby pretended not to notice, suddenly very busy with nothing. The man cleared his throat. "I was younger then," he said, "less experienced." Dean nodded. "So was I." The consultant shifted his weight. "I wanted to say, seeing you now, it's impressive." Dean smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You know what's impressive?" Dean said quietly. "That you still remember me." The man stiffened. "Of course I do." Dean leaned in slightly. "Then you remember this too." He lowered his voice. "You didn't decide who I became." The man swallowed. Before he could respond, the director called out, "Places everyone." Dean stepped away. As he walked back toward the lights, the young assistant director remained seated, frozen, not from fear but from realization. For the first time, he wasn't seeing a celebrity. He was seeing the aftermath of rejection. The performance resumed. But now, something followed Dean into every scene. Grief, defiance, forgiveness he wasn't sure he was ready to give. Each line carried weight. Each pause carried history. The director didn't interrupt. The cameras captured something rare, a man finally letting the world see the cost of becoming untouchable. When the final shot wrapped for the night, no one spoke immediately. Dean removed his jacket slowly. The desert heat waited outside, but inside the air felt colder than ever. Frank approached him again. "That guy," Frank said quietly, "from before." Dean nodded. "Yeah." "You okay with it?" Dean took a long breath. "I didn't owe him anything," he said, "but I owed myself the truth." Across the set, the consultant stood alone, notebook unopened, staring at the floor. And somewhere deep inside Dean Martin, another door creaked open. Because this story wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. There was one more memory waiting. And it was the one he had never allowed himself to face. Night came quietly over Las Vegas. The desert cooled fast, as it always did, as if the heat of the day had never existed at all. Outside Caesar's palace, the lights rose higher, brighter, swallowing the darkness. Inside, the Ocean's 11 set emptied slowly, crew members peeling away in tired clusters, laughter returning in cautious bursts. But Dean Martin did not leave. He sat alone in his chair long after the last camera was powered down, jacket folded neatly on the backrest, cigarette burning untouched between his fingers. Frank Sinatra had already gone, Sammy Davis Jr., too. They had both offered to stay. Dean had waved them off with a soft smile that meant not tonight. This was something he had to sit with by himself. Because once the noise faded, the memory returned with brutal clarity. Not the radio station. Not the rejection. Something worse. The one room he had never spoken about. Dean stood and walked slowly through the empty casino set. The fake tables felt colder now. The glamour had drained out of them. Without the lights, without the extras, it was just a skeleton of illusion. A reminder. This was what he had built his life on: control, timing, charm, distance. Survival. He stopped near the edge of the set where the shadows gathered thickest. The silence pressed against him, and suddenly he wasn't a man in his 40s anymore. He was 33. And the room was real. It had been a hospital room. White walls, too clean, too quiet. The smell of disinfectant clung to everything, sharp and unforgiving. Machines hummed softly, indifferent to the people they kept alive or failed to. Dean remembered standing near the window, hands in his pockets, shoulders stiff. He hadn't known what to do with his face, what expression was expected of him. He had played to thousands of people by then. He could command a room with a single glance. But here, he was helpless. On the bed lay his son. Small, too still. The boy's chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath sounding like it might be the last. Dean's wife sat beside the bed, her hand wrapped tightly around their child's fingers, as if refusing to let him drift away. Dean had wanted to cry, but he didn't, because by then he had already learned the rule. Don't break where people can see you. The doctor had come in quietly, speaking in that careful tone doctors use when they are already preparing you for loss. "We're doing everything we can," the doctor said. Dean nodded. That was what he always did when he didn't know how to respond. His wife looked up at him then, eyes swollen, voice trembling. "Say something." Dean opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He had sung in packed halls. He had made people laugh, forget, believe. But standing there, he had no words that could fix anything. And the fear, God, the fear, sat so deep in his chest it felt like stone. Later that night, after his wife had fallen asleep in the chair, Dean had stepped out into the hallway. That was when it happened. A nurse passed by, young, exhausted, trying to be kind. "He's strong," she said gently, "but sometimes these things just happen." Dean stared at the wall. The sentence landed wrong. Too close to something he had heard before. Sometimes these things just happen. The same softness, the same finality. Dean nodded politely and returned to the room. He stood at the foot of the bed, watching his son breathe. And for the first time in his life, he felt something worse than rejection. He felt powerless. That night, after hours of silence, his son's breathing changed. The machine's rhythm faltered. A nurse rushed in. Then another, doctors followed. Dean didn't move. He stood perfectly still, hands clenched so tightly his nails cut into his palms. He watched. He survived. His son did not. Years later, people would talk about Dean Martin as if he were untouched by tragedy. They would call him carefree, lucky, untethered. They never knew that the night he lost his son was the night something inside him shut down completely. Because grief demanded vulnerability. And vulnerability had never been safe. Back on the Ocean's 11 set, Dean leaned against a pillar, breathing slowly, eyes closed. That was why the sentence had stopped him earlier. Does this guy actually act, or is he just being himself? Because the truth was far more uncomfortable. Dean Martin didn't act because acting required opening doors he had spent decades sealing shut. When you let yourself feel, you risk feeling everything. Loss, failure, love. And Dean had already lost more than most people could imagine. Footsteps echoed faintly behind him. Dean didn't turn. "I figured I'd find you here," a voice said quietly. It was the young assistant director. "I didn't mean to intrude," the young man added quickly. "I just couldn't leave." Dean took a moment before responding. "You ever lose someone?" he asked without turning around. The young man hesitated. "My father," he said, "last year." Dean nodded once, "Then you know." They stood in silence. "People think being relaxed means not caring," Dean said finally. "They're wrong." He turned now, meeting the young man's eyes. "It means caring so deeply that you learn how to hide it." The young man swallowed hard. "I didn't know," he said. Dean smiled faintly. "No one does, that's the point." The young man shifted. "That consultant, the one from earlier, he asked about you." Dean's jaw tightened slightly. "What did he say?" "That he always wondered what would have happened if you'd believed him." Dean laughed softly. "That's the thing," he said. "I almost did." He looked back toward the empty set. "And if I had," he continued, "none of this would exist." The young man nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. "I won't forget today," he said. Dean placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Good, then it wasn't for nothing." As the young man walked away, Dean remained standing there, staring into the shadows. The hardest part wasn't the rejection. It wasn't the loss. It was knowing that surviving had come at the cost of being fully seen. And tomorrow would force him to choose. Because there was one final confrontation left. One final truth to speak. And once spoken, there would be no returning to silence. Morning returned to Las Vegas without ceremony. The desert light crept in slowly, pale at first, then relentless. Caesar's palace woke the way it always did, machines humming back to life, footsteps echoing across marble floors, the illusion rebuilding itself brick by brick. On the Ocean's 11 set, the crew gathered early. There was a subtle difference in the air, something unspoken but unmistakable. People moved more carefully. Conversations were quieter. Eyes lingered longer. Word had spread. Not details, no one knew those, but everyone knew something had happened, something rare. Dean Martin arrived without announcement. No entourage, no flourish. Same loosened tie, same unhurried walk. But the man inside the suit had changed. The director called for positions, cameras aligned, extras took their places. The casino illusion returned, bright and flawless. Dean stepped into the light. Across the set, the consultant stood near the edge, black notebook clutched tighter than before. He had slept poorly, his face showed it. He had come early for one reason only. He needed to finish something. Dean noticed him immediately. Not with anger. With clarity. The scene began. Dean delivered his lines with ease, but there was something else now. A steadiness that hadn't been there before. Each word landed clean, not polished for approval, not softened for comfort. The director felt it again. "Hold," he whispered. Dean finished the scene anyway. When it ended, there was no hesitation. "That's it," the director said quietly. "Perfect." No applause followed, none was needed. Dean stepped down from the set and walked directly toward the consultant. No witnesses were invited. But everyone watched. They stopped a few feet apart. The consultant spoke first. "I owe you an apology." Dean waited. I didn't understand then, the man continued. I thought I was protecting the industry, protecting standards. Dean nodded slowly. That's what people always say when they're afraid of change. The man's shoulders dropped slightly. I was wrong. Dean studied him for a long moment. Wrong isn't the important part, Dean said. What you do after is. The consultant hesitated. I wondered many times what would have happened if you'd listened to me. Dean smiled. So did I. A beat. And then I realized something, Dean continued. If I had listened, I would have disappeared. The man looked down. Dean stepped closer, not threatening, not imposing. You didn't make me stronger, Dean said calmly. Losing almost did. The consultant's voice cracked. I'm sorry. Dean nodded once. I believe you, he said. And with that, he turned away. No forgiveness speech, no dramatic closure. Just truth. As Dean walked back toward his chair, the young assistant director watched him with something close to awe. This was power he had never seen before. Not authority. Not dominance. Restraint. Frank Sinatra joined Dean moments later, handing him a cigarette without a word. Dean took it but didn't light it. You done? Frank asked quietly. Dean looked out across the set. The lights, the people, the carefully constructed dream. Yes, he said, I think I am. Frank studied him. You didn't tear him down. Dean smiled faintly. Never needed to. The day moved on. Scenes were shot. Laughter returned, cautiously at first, then freely. But something fundamental had shifted. The young assistant director would remember this day for the rest of his life. Years later, when he ran his own sets, when someone stumbled or failed or didn't fit neatly into expectations, he would remember the man who didn't raise his voice and changed everything anyway. That night, Dean Martin left the set early. He didn't go to a party. He didn't go to a bar. He walked alone through the quiet Vegas streets, the neon buzzing softly above him. For once, he didn't feel the need to perform for it. In his hotel room, he sat by the window, city lights stretching endlessly below. He thought of the radio station hallway, the hospital room, the closed doors, the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. And finally, he allowed himself to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. The next day, the newspapers would talk about the film, about the Rat Pack, about glamour and charm. They would never write about the sentence. But everyone who was there knew. Dean Martin hadn't yelled. He hadn't humiliated anyone. He hadn't demanded respect. He had done something far rarer. He had stood still. And in that stillness, everyone understood. Real power doesn't scream. Real victory doesn't need witnesses. Some wars are won decades after they begin. And some men don't act at all. They survive. They endure. They prove everyone wrong quietly. Like Dean Martin did on the set of Ocean's 11. The end.